Stanleyville, Kansas is one of the smallest places in America. Not much happens there. Not many people live there. Not many people would want to live there. There's not much law in Stanleyville because there's not much crime. A man named Kobe Sidwell has been the sheriff of Stanleyville, Kansas for 25 years. And the way things are going, he'll probably still be the sheriff 25 years from now. You see, Kobe is a good man. He's honest, he's fair, he respects people, and all he asks in return is that people respect him and obey common courtesy and common decency type laws. That's all Kobe Sidwell asks of the people. Now, there are a few things that Kobe won't tolerate. Now, naturally, murder. Kobe will put you in jail if you're a murderer. If you're a thief, Kobe Sidwell will lock you up for being a thief. If you're drunk out in public, oh boy, Kobe doesn't like that. You see, little kids might see you staggering around, acting silly. You'll be a bad influence on the kids. Kobe doesn't like that. So, Sheriff Kobe Sidwell will definitely lock you up for being drunk in public. And if you happen to be the kind of fellow who likes to beat your wife, oh no. No, Kobe won't tolerate that. Kobe will definitely slap you behind bars if you're a wife beater. Like I said, Kobe Sidwell is a good man. And there's one other thing that Kobe Sidwell won't tolerate. You can't ride your motorcycle north of the railroad tracks. You see, the town of Stanleyville is divided right down the middle by a set of railroad tracks. You got the south part on one side, you got the north part on the other side. Well, see, a lot of families live north of the railroad tracks. They've got kids, small kids and stuff. So Kobe Sidwell said, you can ride your motorcycles south of the railroad tracks, but you can't ride them north because motorcycle riders tend to be a little rowdy and raucous, and Sheriff Kobe is afraid that one of them might accidentally hit a kid. So he said, ride your motorcycles south of the railroad tracks. So people have abided by that law for a long time. Nobody ever challenged Kobe's law, but everybody knew a day would come when somebody would. They knew somebody would challenge that law. And wouldn't you know that it would have to be David and Larry Remaker. Now those two fellas had been in some kind of trouble almost since the day they were born. I mean, they just had a mean, evil streak in them that wouldn't quit. They were always getting into something from the time they were children up until the time they were around 18 or 19 years old when they got their first motorcycles. So they didn't like Sheriff Kobe's law about not riding your motorcycle north of the railroad track, and they figured they were the ones who were going to put an end to that law. So they told everybody around that they were going to do it. They were going to ride their motorcycles north of the railroad tracks. Sheriff Kobe heard about it. So one Saturday afternoon, it was supposed to happen. A crowd of people gathered at the railroad tracks. Larry and David Remaker gathered at the railroad tracks. And Sheriff Kobe Sidwell gathered there too. And he said, boys, don't do this. He said, don't challenge me. He said, don't make me have to lock you up or make me hurt you. He said, stay on the south side of the tracks if you're going to ride those bikes. So you know my law, obey my law, don't come over here. But Larry and David Remaker, they weren't listening. So they revved up their motorcycles and they zoomed past Sheriff Kobe Sidwell. And they were on the north side of his tracks. They had broken his law. They rode about half a mile down the street, turned around, and zoomed back past Sheriff Kobe Sidwell. And then they stopped and looked back at him and laughed. Sheriff Kobe said, "You boys are under arrest. Say, you've broken my law about riding motorcycles north of the railroad tracks. Say, you are under arrest." And Larry and David just laughed and revved up their motorcycles and zoomed on out of town. You see, the Remekers were a big family. They lived on the outskirts of town. There were a whole bunch of them. So David and Larry figured once they got home they would be safe. They figured Sheriff Kobe wouldn't dare come out there and try to arrest them at home. But Sheriff Kobe Sidwell had other ideas. He jumped into his car and he followed those boys right on out of town and went right up to their place. And once again he told them, said, "You boys are under arrest." And their daddy, Big Al Remeker, said, "Kobe, what are you talking about? What do you mean my boys are under arrest? So what are you trying to do?" And so Kobe said, "Al, your boys rode their motorcycles north of the railroad tracks. They broke my law. I warned them not to do it. So they're under arrest." And Big Al Remeker said, "Oh, Kobe, now you know you can't arrest my boys." He said, "You know I'm not going to allow you to do that." And Sheriff Kobe Sidwell said, "Now what are you planning to do to stop me?" Al said, "Are you going to pull a knife on me? You're going to pull a rifle on me? You're going to pull a pistol on me?" So what are you going to do to stop me? And Big Al Remeker said, "Oh, I'm not going to use a weapon." He said, "I'm just going to use my fists. I'm going to beat the devil out of you." So Big Al came at Kobe Sidwell, and Kobe squared off to meet him, and Big Al threw the first punch, but Kobe Sidwell threw the next three, and Big Al Remeker wound up down there in the dirt with his nose bleeding and hurting real bad. And Kobe Sidwell stood over him and said, "Now have you had enough?" And Big Al just nodded his head. And Sheriff Kobe Sidwell pointed at David and Larry. He said, "Now you boys are under arrest, just like I said." He said, "You get in the back of my car, I'm taking you to jail." Well, Larry and David knew it wasn't going to do them any good to argue and try to fight, so they got in the back of Sheriff Kobe's car and he took them to jail. Kept them there 10 days. Now you would have figured that the Remeker boys had learned their lesson, not to mess with Sheriff Kobe Sidwell. But they hadn't. As soon as they got out of jail, they began to form some other plans about how to break Sheriff Kobe's law about the motorcycle. They figured they needed somebody real big and tough to take on the sheriff. They kept thinking, now who can we get? Who can we get? And then they thought about Bootlow McGinney. Oh, Bootlow McGinney was a strange fella. He used to be all right, but he went to the Army for a couple of years and something happened. Nobody knows for sure what happened to Bootlow McGinney while he was in the Army, but when he came back home, he was strange and weird. He moved into an old house way out in the woods and lived out there by himself, and you know, he never bothered anybody. He was peaceful and everything, but boy, Bootlow was strange. And Larry and David Remeker figured that's exactly the guy we need to get to break Sheriff Kobe's law. So they went out to Bootlow's house and talked with him, and Bootlow said, "Oh, I'm not interested in motorcycles. I'm not interested in the law. Just leave me alone." So Larry and David said, "We'll give you $50. Well, Bootlow McGinney was interested in money. He said, "You will?" And they said, "Sure." He said, "We'll give you $50 if you'll ride a motorcycle north of the railroad track." And Bootlow said, "Well, I don't know how to ride." And Larry and David said, "We'll teach you." Well, Bootlow was kind of slow up in the head. It took them darn near a week to teach him how to ride a motorcycle. But they finally did it. They taught him how to ride it. And so, again, on a Saturday afternoon, a whole crowd of people gathered at the railroad tracks. Sheriff Kobe Sidwell gathered at the railroad tracks. Larry and David Remeker were there, smiling. They figured something good was going to happen. And poor Bootlow McGinney was there. And so as he sat on his motorbike getting ready to cross the tracks, Sheriff Kobe Sidwell walked up to him. Sheriff Kobe had a cardboard box under his arm. And he said, Bootlow, don't do this. He said, don't let these Remica boys use you and make a fool out of you. He said, stay on the south side of the tracks. He said, don't bring that motorcycle over here. But Bootlow said, no, Sheriff, I'm going to ride my motorcycle north of the track. Sheriff Kobe Sidwell said, please, Bootlow, don't do it. He said, don't let them use you. Don't let them make a fool out of you, get you in trouble. He said, no, Sheriff, I'm going to ride my motorcycle north of the tracks. Well, Sheriff Kobe Sidwell saw that it wasn't going to do any good to talk to Bootlow McGinney. So Sheriff Kobe opened up that cardboard box that he had under his arm, and he reached in and pulled out a long snake. And he threw that snake in Bootlow McGinney's lap, and Bootlow jumped. Oh, Bootlow went crazy. He jumped off of that motorcycle. The motorcycle fell to the ground. Bootlow started running, and boy, he kept running until he had totally disappeared. Nobody knew where he went. You see, Sheriff Kobe Sidwell knew that Bootlow McGinney was scared to death of rattlesnakes. So that's how he got rid of him. He told the Remica boys that you can pick up your motorcycle and get it out of here. And oh boy, Larry and David, boy, they were so embarrassed and angry and upset and everything. And a big crowd of people, they just laughed and laughed. They were laughing at Bootlow. They were laughing at Larry and David. Oh, it was pitiful. So the Remica boys, they picked up the motorcycle and got it on the way from the railroad tracks. And Sheriff Kobe Sidwell stood there triumphant. Once again, he had foiled the plans of somebody to break his motorcycle off. So you would have figured that was the end of it, that nobody else would challenge the law. But doggone it, no. Larry and David just couldn't get it through their heads that they should leave well enough alone. Once again, they looked around and said, oh, what are we going to do now? I said, we got to find somebody else to break that law. So they decided they would get a girl this time. They said, surely Sheriff Kobe Sidwell won't lock up a girl. So they found him one. Betty Rutherford. Oh my goodness, she was well known as a rough, tough little something. But she didn't know how to ride motorcycles. So once again, they faced the same problem they faced with Bootlow. They had to teach somebody how to ride a motorcycle in order to get them to break the law about riding it north of the railroad track. So they worked with Betty. It took her about the same amount of time as it took Bootlow McGinney. It took about a week to teach her how to ride a motorcycle. But they finally got her trained and everything, taught her how to ride a motorcycle. And so another Saturday afternoon came around. Another crowd of people gathered at the railroad tracks. Sheriff Kobe Sidwell gathered at the railroad tracks. Larry and David Remica were there. And of course, there was Betty Rutherford. Oh, gee, this was going to be a goodie. Was Sheriff Kobe going to lock up a woman, a young girl, for riding a motorcycle north of his railroad tracks? Was that going to happen? Everybody was waiting to see. The crowd was mighty anxious. So once again, Sheriff Kobe Sidwell, he walked up to Betty the same as he had done with Bootlow McGinney. He said, Betty, don't let them use you like this. He said, don't let them make a fool of you. He said, those Remica boys are just troublemakers. Said, don't let them get you put in jail or fined or anything like that. Said, turn around and go back. Don't bring that motorcycle across these tracks. And Betty just laughed at him. She said, oh, I'm coming. She said, Sheriff Kobe, I'm coming across those tracks on my motorcycle. Well, Sheriff Kobe saw there was no need of talking to her, so he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a little jar. And that jar was full of worms. And he unscrewed the top and he put those worms down the back of Betty Rutherford's jacket and her little blouse, and oh, she went crazy. She was a jumping and a wiggling. She jumped off the motorbike fell to the ground. She was a jumping and a stomping around and a hopping and a screaming and a yelling, and she took off running for home. And boy, she didn't stop until she was inside the house and in the bathtub, and she stayed there for 2 hours or more trying to get herself clean. She was such a hurry to get a bath taken, she jumped in with the clothes on at first. It was off. Those slimy worms all down her back. But that's all it took to get rid of her. Once again, Sheriff Kobe Sitwell had spoiled the attempt of somebody to ride their motorcycle north of his railroad tracks. So Larry and David had run out of ideas. And so they were sitting around one day, and they said, you know what? Said, we paid Bootlow McGinney $50 to ride his motorcycle north of the tracks, and you know he didn't do it. They said, we ought to go back out there and get our $50 back. And the two brothers agreed with each other. They said, why, yeah, so that's $50 wasted. Said, we ought to go back out there and get our money back from Bootlow. So Larry and David Remaker hopped on their motorcycles one day, and they roared out there to Bootlow's old house and went up on the porch and banged on the door. And they said, Bootlow McGinney, said, we paid you $50 to ride your motorcycle north of the tracks, and you didn't do it, so we want our $50 back. And Bootlow gave him a funny stare, and then he punched both of them right in the nose, knocked them flat on their backs right there on the porch. Well, they knew they'd better not push the subject any further. So, boy, they jumped up and scampered off of that porch and jumped on their motorbikes and roared away from there. And that was the last time David and his brother Larry had anything to do with Bootlow McGinney. Then they got to thinking about the same $50 that they had given Betty Rutherford. And they said, well, why don't we go get our money back from Betty? Said she didn't ride the bike north of the tracks either. And good thing one of the brothers had a little sense. They said, hey, maybe we better just leave it alone, you know. Said, my nose is still hurting from that punch I got from Bootlow, and who knows what Betty is liable to do. Said, maybe we better just forget about it and admit that we failed. And so that's exactly what they did. They finally realized that they had failed to break Sheriff Kobe Sitwell's law about riding the motorcycle north of the railroad tracks. They didn't try anymore. And so, to this day, that law is still in effect. If you ever go to Stanleyville, Kansas, and you're riding a motorcycle, just be careful. Remember, you can't ride that motorcycle north of the railroad tracks. Remember that.